At Howard, I primarily teach classical art and classical mythology. I've also taught on slavery in the ancient world. And my presentation today is going to be on a pedagogical approach that I use in classical art that empowers students and instructs them in art historical and archaeological methods. So as I've been listening today and thinking about this, I'm realizing it really is the visual version of the Socratic method. So it just dovetails really nicely with everything that I've been learning. So hopefully you can see my title screen here. So it has my title and then also the subtitle, which treats the statues I'm going to talk about, which are from the Nile Valley in Africa and in Eastern Mediterranean, which is Greece. And I also included a little clip art of a tree. So Anika, this was inspired by your presentation last month and gave the Frank M. Snowden Jr. lecture. And her talk was on Africa and the roots of the classical tradition in Africa. So the tree metaphor, which came out this morning, when Junius was speaking, sort of came back. So that's what I'm referring to also. And I found the metaphor, like it challenged me. It also really dovetailed with the way that I teach art. And I think with everything that I'm going to say today, the tree metaphor is really beautiful and useful here too, because the art that I'm going to talk about, it starts in the Nile Valley in Africa, and then it's picked up by the Greeks. So, literally you have the sort of trunk where the art starts and then the branch. So it's just really exciting. Also, since I mentioned Frank M. Snowden Jr., just wanted to give a sentence or two about him. So he was a professor of classics at Howard University from the 1950s, at least to the 1980s. And he was really the backbone of the classics department. I myself was not fortunate enough to meet him since I joined after he had passed away, but his influence is still very much part of classics at Howard. So his two books, Blacks in Antiquity and Before Color Prejudice, were also really important in the field, and they remain the seminal texts for interest in Black representation, Black people in texts and images. So what I'm talking about today isn't necessarily overlapping sort of directly with Snowden today. I'm hoping in June to maybe bring in a little bit more of, especially the visual things from his book. But where my presentation is very much in the spirit of Frank Snowden and other scholars is that, as his book Before Color Prejudice, as the title suggests, that there is no color prejudice in antiquity, that this did not exist. And this is very much evident in the artworks. And if people are interested in chatting more about kind of the finer points of that, I would be happy to kind of get into that more too. So for today, I want to focus on my approach to bringing in ancient statues and what this looks like in my classes. And one of the things that I try to do is to show a variety of depictions of men and women. And in class, we started in the Nile Valley and eventually in Greece, because what the artistic record shows us, and this has been recognized in classics for a long time, so this isn't new information, but what the artistic record shows us is also like that tree, that there are a lot of people that look, are depicted different physically, have different hairstyles, different clothing, jewelry. So human diversity is very much in the art of the classical tradition. And it's really, I have to look this up, but when Amber, during her presentation, said, because they always should have been there, I immediately thought of classical art, because it's really the same thing. And so some of what Snowden's work was doing was kind of because they always should have been there, particularly with depictions of Black people in Greco-Roman art. So in my classes, what I like to do for my Socratic method is start with a work of art, which is what I'm going to do with you guys. And then ask them to describe it. So sometimes without giving them historical information, other times with doing historical information, I basically put up some art on the screen and I go, okay, what do you see? And right away, this tells students, like, you come to the class knowing something, that your innate abilities are here and you're going to use them in class. So like the art that we're looking at is not exclusive, and looking at art is not exclusive. And then second, I want them to draw on their own perspectives when they're talking about visual culture. So I found that I think this is where Howard in particular has really influenced my teaching. And I found that it's the most useful in the classroom to really start with where students are. Because otherwise, if I go into just explaining this sort of kind of somewhat esoteric art historical point, it loses people. It's not really part of the point. And so, with number two, starting where they're at, I think is helpful for their engagement. But not only that, it works historically. So I have noted over the course of my teaching that when the students drive the questions for the works of art, we hit the historical points that I want us to hit. We'll also there'll be some kind of additional information and we'll sort of help them with like, well, we can answer that historically, or we can't, and so forth. But this method, is not like it's better in all ways than say me just sort of lecturing. So finally, the way that this is empowering is really that it's honing the students' innate skills of looking closely and describing. And I'm giving them, or through class, they're getting a vocabulary. So I try to use ancient words from ancient Egypt, ancient Greece, and also art historical terms. And they can then use these in class, but also I have them do some assignments where they get to pick works of art themselves and they can use the same vocabulary. So I think this is kind of, again, the sort of visual Socratic method. Actually, I can see myself, but not my screen very well. So pause. Okay, well. Okay, so before I get into the visual art, bear with me. I just want to show you a map. So where we're looking at for this story of art and where it begins in Africa is in the Eastern Hemisphere. So I try to show the map to my students to get across the hugeness of our globe and also the hugeness of the areas where we're looking at art, but also their kind of size relative to the bigger globe. So the area that you see in green, this is basically the geographic extent, maybe a little bit more in Nile Valley in Africa, but this is basically the geographic extent of where the art that we look at comes from. And so, it shows you that it's, for example, a fairly small part of the African continent. It's also just kind of a tiny part of, what sticks out of Europe and Asia. So we're really focusing on kind of the Eastern Mediterranean. And for this presentation, I'm doing a mini version of that. So the statues that you'll see will come first from the Nile Valley in Africa, and then we'll look at the art from the city-states. So again, you have the map here. I also like to use modern maps a little bit so we can kind of get a sense of like the size of the geographic areas we're talking about. So like, for example, in the Nile Valley, you have at least 3 sort of political designations with Egypt, Nubia and Kush, and then Punt. And these are basically on the western, sort of northwestern coast of Africa. So Egypt, Sudan, Eritrea, Ethiopia, and Somalia. And this whole kind of area that we know that was interconnected in antiquity is about 3,325 miles. So when I'm teaching and we're talking about the art, I want students to kind of put this into a modern kind of understanding of the sort of size of the world that we're talking about, and sort of get the sense of the statues, reflecting human diversity, but also kind of interconnectedness. More recently, too, scholars are talking about Nile Valley civilizations, Nile Valley peoples, the kind of traditional way, and like in classic traditional way of talking about Nile Valley is Egypt. You talk about the empire of ancient Egypt and so forth. And this tends to kind of leave out Kush, for example. So Nile Valley civilizations is a preferable term, and hopefully with more interest in archaeology, we'll learn more and have more examples from the Nile Valley to talk about. The other sort of first thing I wanted to do today, and then I try to do with students, is ancient Greek and Roman art, especially that which was made of marble and wood and so forth. It was painted, so it was polychrome. So this is something that we do not see enough of in scholarship or in our buildings, in part because European traditions that were inspired by Greek art, they were seeing unpainted or marble with a lot less paint and color on it. So they developed this kind of white marble aesthetic. And if people are interested, I can point you into more discussions about that. But here on the left, you have some examples of painted architecture. So if you get to go to Greece, for example, or you get to see Greek temples, you should always try to remember that they were actually colorful in antiquity. So the digital reconstruction on the bottom probably gives you the best example here, where you have the blue and red and yellow. They often will have human figures. Those figures would be painted naturalistically, and the color would be very much part of the aesthetic and also how ancient people would actually read these images. So I think I like to tell the students, I think that if someone from ancient Greece like walked into DC, they would be like, why are the buildings so colorless? This, it's not how they're supposed to be. So there aren't very many examples of original polychromy from Greece. Again, happy to talk about that more if people are interested. But we do have some examples. So I try to show these really often in class. And the one on the right is a very, very rare example of painting from the 6th century BCE on wood of a sacrifice scene. So I'll be coming back to this later. Again, my main point that I wanted to kind of remind us of is polychromy in ancient art, particularly ancient Greek and Roman art. Okay, so now let's start our story of statuary and sculpture. So large scale or human-sized monumental stone statues start in the Nile Valley in Africa. So this is where we have our earliest examples. I kind of leave out Mesopotamia a little bit in this conversation. So I hope if anyone is just forgive me for that, but Nile Valley has the most and sort of the early. So Nile Valley is our first stone statues. And this starts about 4,000 years ago. This is in the era of the pyramids, sometimes called the Old Kingdom. So if you were in one of my classes or here for this presentation, what I'd like to sort of ask you to do is look closely at the statue that I'm showing you in the center. So if you want to jot down, I'm going to get to this in the presentation, but if you want to jot down, like, what do you see? What do you notice about this? I'm going to give you a little historical information, but the main sort of thing that I'm interested in sort of having us start from or students start from is really what do they see here when they look at this? So again, for historical context for our statue, he's from the beginning of statuary in the ancient world. I chose this particular figure rather than a pharaoh. So the pharaohs actually get represented earlier since they're the king, it makes sense. But I chose this particular one because he's a beautiful example of polychromy. So here you see his naturalistic skin tone, hair color. You also, if you look closely at his eyes, you see that eyeliner that we know from depictions of ancient Egyptians. So it's a fairly naturalistic presentation. Another thing I want to do or like to do in my classes is particularly for things like jewelry. We don't have much clothing because it was made of cloth that doesn't survive. But if we have jewelry, I like to show them actual examples. So on the bottom left, you have beaded collars, and these would be worn by pharaohs and wealthy individuals. So on the figure on the right, where you see the kind of naked stone, that was where a collar would have been painted. And I think it's important not only to show them the statues as kind of the origin of the artistic tradition in the ancient world in the Nile Valley, but also the material culture and craft that artists were working on and making. I think this also has the benefit of we can connect this to jewelry today, to jewelry in Africa, for example. Particularly the collars remind me of kind of more modern day jewelry. So, looking at material culture in addition to the statues has that sort of effect. A couple of other examples here from the Old Kingdom, again, the beginning of stone sculpture. So one thing I'd like you to notice and kind of keep in mind, because we're eventually going to get to the Greek sculpture branch. One thing to notice with these figures, particularly the one on the left and the previous one, is that they are all standing with their arms at their sides. And when the left foot, it's always the left foot extended in the front. Art historians call this the walking pose. It's invented in Egypt. It's a very prominent part of their statuary for thousands of years. Very big on tradition. So this is something I talk about in class in terms of technique, in terms of how we recognize things as being from the Nile Valley. And then I would ask students again, what do you see now that we've seen a work of the Old Kingdom? How do you know this is a work from the Old Kingdom? And in this case, you might notice that the figures in the middle and on the left all have sort of chin length hairstyles, and that's one of the features of the Old Kingdom. And the figures in the center, you see a man and a woman. So usually when I have students describing them, we start sort of talking about like gender. How can you see femaleness versus maleness being depicted here? You know, these kind of accept like this, does this surprise you? Is it unusual, so forth? And on the far right, I'm showing you at least one pharaoh. This is Menkaure, also from the Old Kingdom. So he's one of the pharaohs that the pyramid was built for. And this is a sculpture of him, so sort of portrait sculpture. And one of the questions that often comes up in my classes, which is, you know, do the statues look like what people actually looked like in antiquity? And again, we can talk more about that in the questions. I don't want to sort of steal anybody's curiosity thunder. But one thing I will say when that question comes up in class that I try to do is give students a sense of what kinds of historical evidence they can use to answer that question. So like with Makari, for example, I'm only showing you one portrait, but I could show you a number of portraits where he looks just like this, where he has the same facial structure, that's sort of kind of rounded and kind of high cheekbones, rounded nose, and so forth. So like we see multiple statues of Makari with this appearance. So you might be able to use that if you wanted to say, okay, this is based on what he actually looked like in antiquity. And this also gets into questions of realism versus art being sort of more stylized. But okay, I don't want to go too far on a tangent. So, okay, so we've seen some depictions of men from ancient Egyptian statuary. Show you a couple of women. So in the New Kingdom, these are two depictions of women. So you have a queen on the left. So, you know, take a look at her for a moment. One of the overarching things of classical art is always something more realistic versus more stylized. And when I first started teaching, I tended to give students an answer for that question where I would be like, okay, this is more stylized or this is more realistic. But I quickly found, and I hope someday to publish on this, that it's very subjective and also I think could have a cultural determination factor. And so I've kind of tended to get away from that. And it's, I think, been really salutary to my teaching and just thinking about art. So I really, you know, when I'm asking students to look at this, I'm really asking them, so do you think this is more realistic, less realistic? What are your reasons? So for example, here on the left, the way I see the figure and her hair is it's a bit more sort of stylized. In the granite sculpture, we don't see the back of her hair. So this is kind of less realistic because of course, in person, this actual person would be 3D. But on the right, you have a statue in wood where you have her whole body in 3D. So it's more realistic. And two things that I like you to notice here, so in terms of our story of art, is the way the woman's hair sort of frames her face and then sits in kind of a perfectly symmetrical line on her shoulders. This particular way of representing hair, which may also mean the way that people wore their hair, was very common in the Nile Valley, then becomes common in Asia, and we see it in ancient Greece and Italy during early periods. So it's this style that you see starting in the Nile Valley becomes the kind of international style. So again, thinking of our sort of tree metaphor. And the last thing I'll say about these two is in the art class, I try to talk about medium as well. So like with stone sculpture, the way the artist is manipulating stone to either make it sort of more realistic versus the wooden statue and how this kind of affects the overall appearance and then what we can say about it historically. So besides the hair, the other thing to notice for our Egyptian woman is her pose is very kind of self-contained. So the one on the right has a little bit of a step forward, but it's very subtle. So we'll see this with our depictions of Greek women. So finally, and this is where I'm fortunate to be teaching art when I am, because museum websites are quite sophisticated. So today it's actually pretty easy to look through museum websites and find works of art that aren't in the textbooks or aren't frequently shown, like in your magazines or what you might see on TV. So I do try to show kind of a range. And then again, in certain classes, I might have like a group of statues, like say here from the Amarna period of the New Kingdom, or for classical Greece. And I'll be like, which ones do you guys want to talk about? And we'll go from which ones they're interested in. And this gets past the problem of focusing on the greatest hits. So in probably all fields, really, there ends up being certain works that everyone kind of continually talks about. They become really famous. And I don't mean that as a negative thing, it just sort of ends up happening when there's, famous works. But then this can kind of limit the scope of what we see. So, for example, the very, very famous Queen Nefertiti on the right, everyone has seen before. This is in Berlin. It's plaster. So I like to show her, but in the larger historical context and museological context, which is that she comes from the workshop of a sculptor for the royal family. And the portraits that you see on the left, so it's a pair of portraits, and I'm giving you a frontal view and sort of a side view. These come from the same archaeological context as the famous Nefertiti on the bottom right. So I'll kind of give folks a second to sort of look at them and appreciate them. These also may have been painted in antiquity. So they are made of plaster, which is a material that was particularly it's like commonly painted. And the Nefertiti, the one that is Nefertiti of the portraits, is on the right of the pair. So if you wanted to kind of look at how she compares to the more famous portrait, so this is her and her husband, the pharaoh Akhenaten. Also during this period, you might notice the pictures or the portraits are quite realistic, which is another thing that we try to talk about in my class. So, okay, there's your 10-minute overview of ancient sculpture from the Nile Valley in Africa. So think of that as the root of our classical art tree. I'm sorry if I'm belaboring now the metaphor. I need to stop. I'm just really excited. So, okay, so we've been in the Nile Valley in Africa, and actually most of the works that I've been showing you in this presentation are from kind of south in what is today the modern nation of Egypt along the Nile Valley. So now we're going to move into the art of the Greek city-states. So what we've been seeing in the Nile Valley is about 4,000, 3,000 years ago. When we start talking about Greek art that's based on Egyptian art, it's about 2,000 years away from us and about 1,000 years after what was developed in Egypt. And just for geographic thinking, I put into Google Maps, if you were to drive from the Nile Delta to Athens, it's a little over 2,000 miles. We know from various archaeological historical sources that sailors really from Africa, from Asia, from Greece, like from all over the Mediterranean, the way that they would move around here would be to hug the coast with their ships. So that would be how people would move around. And presumably this is part of how the artistic style comes from the Nile Valley and sort of moves into Greece. So this is our earliest example of a Greek freestanding sculpture 2,600 years ago. So prior to this, there's a period where there actually is really no monumental art in ancient Greece, so nothing life-size, not much depictions of human bodies. That period where there's not much monumental art is one in which Greece is quite isolated. So their artistic output comes back and is very rich when they become reconnected with Asia and Africa. And again, this story is not new. This is how I learned the story in undergrad. This is, what everyone talks about. But I think that the sort of emphasis where context hasn't been there to think again about the sort of larger cultural context happening in the Nile Valley, and then how things sort of shift or move over into the Greek world and sort of how that style happens. So sometimes in my classes, I might show this particular statue at the beginning of the semester without talking about like where it's from, other than just to say, here's the geographic extent of the course. And I have had students identify this as Egyptian, which, then I tell them they're Greek and they're like, oh, no, wrong. But like, no, you're so right. So if you see this and it looks very Egyptian to you, it's because it is. So the figure is standing in the walking pose that we saw before. He has his fists at his side. His left foot is extended, so the sculptor even copies the left foot. And also, even though the hairstyle is different from what we see in Egypt, you can still kind of see a family resemblance, I would say, where it's sort of long, and you have like the use of vertical and horizontal elements to suggest texture and style. And the one thing about this that is very uniquely Greek and is sort of the Greek contribution to the statuary tradition, if we want to see it as a a kind of connected tradition, is that you have a nude male figure. So the nudity is something that's very much part of the Greek cultural context. So when I start to talk about ancient Greek statues in my classes, again, I try to bring back in polychromy to help students visualize the way the statues actually looked in antiquity. And again, to hopefully kind of shake off some of the maybe narratives or like cultural kind of contexts that cling to the statues as much as possible. It's definitely an imperfect process, but this is an example of how I do it. So I'll show you the Greek statue, the statue made in Attica on the left, and on the right, a couple polychromy. So I brought in Ninkevska for comparison, so you can kind of see of like natural skin tone, hair color, and sort of think about that for the Greek statue. And we do know, and this is sort of more true from later painting, but we do know, especially for the Archaic period and later, the skin tone for Greek men is always kind of copper or like brown. So Ninkeftka, his sort of skin tone would be the same for our Greek statue. So on the far right, you have the sacrifice scene to kind of help you visualize what the young male figure on the left would look like. And polychromy studies are still new, so hopefully there'll be more information coming out, more reconstructions to kind of work from this. So a little bit later than the previous statue. So these are a depiction of twins. They were heroes. So they kind of harken back to the Homeric past, actually, in their great deeds. So some of you might be familiar from Herodotus tells this story where Solon from Greece is visiting King Croesus and Lydia, and the king asks Solon who are the happiest of men, and Solon answers Cleobus and Biton. And in that passage, it's mentioned that after Cleobus and Biton died, two statues were set up in their honor at Delphi, and these are thought to be the two statues depicting them. So again, their heroism is kind of connecting, way back in Greek history, but now looking at them, hopefully you see the Egyptianness of the style, that they are still in the walking pose, hands at their sides. When I show Cleobus and Biton too, and I ask students, what do you see, sort of describe them? Often the hair texture comes into play in style. So sometimes students will describe their hair as being in dreadlocks or locks. So I've done some internet searches, and I think the Wikipedia page for locks had these guys at one point, or still has them as an example, which I also thought was really interesting of how art can be used as evidence, just kind of generally, even sort of outside the classroom. So one thing too, I draw the students' attention to after we sort of talk about, why they see that, how does it sort of look like locks, is the way that the artist is really trying to show texture. So the forehead of the figures, and it's hard to see in the photo, so you have to trust me, the forehead of the figures has curls all along the front. And then you see how they use a combination of horizontal and vertical lines to suggest the way the hair is sort of formed. But in addition to that, over all the hair, there are small curving lines all over the hair to show texture. So you get a sense of this is important to the artist. So kind of going back to that question of like, is this what the people actually looked like? Is this the way they wore their hair? I think one of the ways that you can start to answer that question is to look at the things that the artist emphasized and start kind of thinking about that as a sort of starting point. So those are our depictions of Greek male statuary. So I'm going to show you a couple of women from the same period that's really inspired by Egyptian art. So this is actually a statuette from Italy. So made of plaster, and you can see that the way her hair sort of sits on her shoulders sort of harkens back to our Egyptian queens, also looks a bit like the twins. And then you can see that she has very long hair with little V lines to show texture. And she also has this very closed posture that I pointed out for Egyptian female statuary. So this is something too that we can point to make that direct connection back to the Nile Valley. And in fact, one of the books that I use for teaching this course actually talks about the style as Africanizing, which is a reference to the Nile Valley as the source for how the statues look the way they do. And the last one, so this is sort of a later statue in our early period of Greek art. So you can still see the kind of closed posture of the woman. And this is a great example of one where you can still see polychromy on the statue. So next time you go to the museum, and this is true of any ancient art, and maybe if you're taking your kids, it could be a fun thing to do, but like ask, try to look closely at the statues, because again, this is one of the things that's always been there and should always been have talked about more, but you can see it with your naked eye. And in fact, last year at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, there was an exhibition on polychromy, and a friend of mine is a curator there, and she was talking about many of the works that they went back over had visible polychromy. So it's like a huge amount. It's not just one or two. So the statue that you're seeing here is actually still in Athens. And you notice a lot of red is still visible to the eye. This has to do with the chemical compound in the pigments. And you can see a little bit of her garments, some of the textile designs there. You also can see how the hair style has changed, or maybe texture, but you still have the sort of long vertical lines, in this case kind of wavy, and something of the way the hair sort of falls on her shoulders, maybe harkening back to an earlier period. So two examples of possible polychrome reconstruction on the left here for our female statue. So when you are using these polychrome reconstructions, it's really important to remember that they're interpretations and that the study of polychromy is still fairly new. So there's a lot that we can say, that scholars are hopefully going to continue to say, but you need to, look at them critically. So one great example is that, with painting, especially for a statue that's been outside, layers of color might have gone away over time. So the only color that we have left may not be actually what the statue looked like. So to take red, for example, so we have red on the hair of the figure. In the far left in the reconstruction, they've just imagined that her hair was completely painted red. So you can see what that looks like. And then the one in the middle, they have suggested that maybe the red was darker, and then even other colors to add brown. It's also quite possible that her hair was black and the red is part of an undercoat. So there's a lot of possibilities to kind of keep in mind. But I think it's really important to use these polychrome reconstructions because they get us closer to what ancient people were seeing. And also, if you're reading your classical texts and you hear, description of artworks or statues, if we're talking about like in Plato or Aristotle, when they were going and walking around Athens, they were seeing colorful works of art rather than, again, this kind of white marble that like you see, say, in DC or other cities. So to kind of balance the interpretive aspect, again, with my slides, I always try to give the original polychromy. So on the far right, you can have something that was made by an ancient Greek artist. So what I've hoped to have shown with my little mini history here is the sort of stem of the tradition coming from the Nile Valley in Africa and then being taken up in Greece. And again, this is the sort of story of the origin of Greek art, which gets us to the classical period. So what we've been seeing is part of the archaic period. And then the next stage of the style is really the style that more often when people are talking about like Greek art or European art that they're usually referring to. But what I'd like to suggest to you is that this should not be divorced in any way from what comes before, but rather is really a continuation of a long tradition. So some statues that I thought would be a good example of this come from Athens. So this is the Acropolis. It's a building on the Acropolis. And the statue I'm going to show you comes from, it's called the Porch of the Caryatids. And caryatids are female statues that are sort of acting as columns and supporting the roof. And so here's a close-up of one of them. So you can see particularly like the 5th century classical style, you have this sort of voluminous drapery, and you might think of it as very different, say, from what we saw in the Egyptian models, where their clothing sort of hangs, maybe has a few folds, but it's kind of self-contained. However, her posture and the original posture of the caryatid still has that same kind of closed stance that goes, all the way back to the beginning of Greek art, and then has its roots outside of Greek geography. And I would even go so far as to argue that this is even part of the caryatids here, the statue here being traditional on purpose, that like the statue is supposed to be showing a kind of traditional depiction of a woman. You also have to use your imagination. For her garment was probably brightly painted, and her features, like her hair. So this is a detail. So again, the classical period, and what we usually think of as Greek art, was really not possible in a vacuum or without connections to the wider Mediterranean. So sort of give you this last slide with a bunch of statues that we've seen going through the Old Kingdom, New Kingdom, all the way through the classical period. And then I have a bibliography, some image sources. So I have plenty of time, I think, for questions, or if anybody would like to take me up on the offer to do some visual description of one of the works of art. I'd also like to offer, if folks have questions about how to search for sources or find different works of art in museums, feel free to in the chat or email me at any point. So yeah, thank you very much for your attention, and hope it was of interest.
Woo!
Talking fast.
It was so amazing. I just feel like that talk, and your talk on June 15th is going to continue to expand that, what you talked about today,
Yeah.
because I really almost feel like that should be something that should almost kick off.
Okay.
The reason why I say that, it's such a good visual of the purpose of what we're
Right.
doing.
Yeah.
And you made a statement at the end. You said
Mhm.
it's not, we shouldn't be, we can't distance like ancient Greece and Rome from its
Yeah.
roots. And we
Exactly.
can't, on the other side, because we've seen this too, we can't just say it's, oh, everything began in Africa and then just start there and just leave it there.
Mm-hmm.
Your presentation shows how we are building upon, like the tree, like you said, thank you for using my tree.
Well, I hope it
Uh,
was okay that I kept saying it, and then I was like, oh, maybe it's too much. So yeah,
oh,
okay, cool.
no, that was great.
It's so good.
I love
Yeah.
that we're talking to one another. I mean, it's showing
Mm-hmm.
how connected we are, building upon one another. We're
Mm-hmm.
not fighting for position. It's
Yeah.
all of us. So that was incredible. And I really feel like, I mean, what you shared is something that it just really changes the perspective
Mm-hmm.
you have on this
Yeah.
conversation,
Cool.
by the way. Yeah. Does anyone have any questions? People have been hanging tight with us. They might be tired by now.
Yeah, I understand. That's why I thought if anyone wants to email me, or feel free to reach out later. I'm happy to.
Yes, and I've recorded this. I'm excited to put this up on the channel. The channel has 5 videos up now already.
Sweet.
I was able to upload them, and so these will go up as well when we're done for today. So hopefully between now and next week, or early next week, everything will be up from today's
Excellent.
conversation. So this was just a beautiful presentation. I
Mhm.
want to thank you so much
Yeah, thanks, Amika.
for sharing this with us, Dr. O'Connell. And
Yeah.
let me just see where we are in our schedule. I know Bettina is next,
Mhm.
and she starts at 7. So we have a little bit of like
Mhm.
a
Okay.
15-minute break. Unless anyone, let me see
Mhm.
if there's anything in the Q&A, just to make
Yeah,
sure.
I can also say a little more about what I envisioned for June, just so
Yes,
people kind of have an
yes,
idea. So
great.
so with this talk, I really wanted to get into like the sort of longer history of ancient Greek art, and then I thought for June, what I could talk about would be like the Roman Empire, which brings in more of Snowdon. And so there you have realistic portraiture. You also have a bigger geography with place names, lots of people who are
Yes.
classics can connect with different authors.
Mhm.
So I might, do like a just slide with like, here's what we talked about in
Yes.
May, and then we'll go into Roman portraiture, which I haven't taught in a while either, because in class I never get that far. We start in Egypt and we get as far as classical Greece. So I'm like super excited to do some with
Yeah.
Rome.
And
So
see, by putting this video up, and that'll be
mhm,
great because you'll kind of create that bridge. But by putting this video
yeah.
up, we're going to encourage people to watch this video in
Mhm,
preparation for you're continuing that conversation of showing how these civilizations were actually building upon one
mhm.
another.
Yeah,
This
totally.
whole notion of us trying to claim it as
Yeah.
something unique to us, or that we are the greatest, or we're the greatest contributors. That's a fairly
Mhm.
new concept,
Right.
you
Yeah.
know.
Yeah.
So that's wonderful. So
Yeah.
everyone, what we'll do, if no one has a question,
Mhm.
um, we will stop here for a 15-minute break, but I do love ending with the arts because now we're gonna have
Yeah.
Bettina de Guzman, who's gonna speak to us about ancient music. She has an organization called Ancient Lyric, and she purchases and collects ancient instruments. She looks at different ancient fragments of poetry and what they think to be different songs that were sung during that time, and she tries to replicate how they may have been performed. So she's going to be doing a demonstration. Sadly, that demonstration will not be recorded. So I'm hoping everyone comes and hears it. We will not record it. You got to only see it live. So if you have family and friends who will be like, oh, I really should come to that, they may want to catch this one because hers will not be recorded and you want to catch that concert live. So go off your 15 minutes to say, come on, let's see this last session of Redefining Classics. So I'll see you all in a little bit. Thank you, Shana.
Yeah, thanks. See you later.
Uh, Oh my goodness, Bettina, I see you on the guest side, and I see that I sent you an invitation to join the panel, but I'm going to resend it. So check your email and join the panelist side so everyone can see you. I don't know how this all happened, you guys. I'm so sorry. Um, let me get it over here. Okay. Yeah, you're right here. I'm sending it to info at Ancient Lyric, I think. Did she leave? Okay, so she heard me good. And let me make sure she gets it. All right. But I would say for our first time trying something like this, a full day online conference, we didn't have a lot of tech issues. We made it through. This is our last session. I will not be recording. Oh Lord, she's still back. Bettina, I sent you the email to your Ancient Lyric email to join the panelist side. It's a new link, not on the guest side. You're on the guest side, but you got to join on the panelist side, Bettina. Okay, here she comes. But I would say for our first time having this first gathering online where we bring everyone together for these wonderful conversations, we did not have a lot of technical challenges. So I'm excited about that. I'll be right back. I'm going to close my door. All right, so we'll just give her a little bit of time to join us. We're still on schedule. I hope she gets it. Front door. Wait, no. Front door. Yes. Yay. There she goes.
Hi,
Hi,
sorry about
Bettina.
that.
Oh, no problem. You're like the 10th person that we listen. I said, you know what? This has been a good day. We've had minimal. This has been the least issue. Like we haven't had enough. I was terrified the computer would crash or something, but everything has worked out great. And so, as
Good.
as we promised, we won't be recording. We look forward to hearing you share with us. So I'll let everyone just. Why don't you tell everyone about yourself, and you can get started.
Okay, maybe the best thing is I'll just start sharing and let
Okay.
me see if I can do this. Okay, if I do share screen. All right. Share and then okay. Can everybody see my screen? Oops.
Yes, it's coming across really good.
Okay, all right. Fabulous. So I'll start from here. Slideshow. Okay. All right. And I'll put this over here. Okay. Well, hello everybody.